It's little surprise that President Trump's setting a different tone from his predecessor on civil rights, but his administration, primarily for the Justice Department, has also taken steps to change the course on everything from oversight of police departments and voting requirements to a categorical backtrack on LGBT protection from discrimination. The president also came out with a tweet barring transgender people from serving in the U.S. Armed Forces. Among the groups speaking out against the change is the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights and Economic Justice. We'd like to welcome its staff attorney, Sophia Hall. Thank you very much for being with us, Sophia.
Thank you for having me, Chris.
I know the president's tweet got a lot of attention recently, but even before that, around the same time maybe, there was this effort by the Justice Department about LGBT discrimination by employers. What's going on with that exactly?
So there was a case out of New York, and the federal government wrote a brief as next friend, basically an interested party that wanted to make a statement on behalf of the matter. And the Justice Department made a claim that sexual orientation, what we consider to be a protected class, should not, in fact, be deemed that under Title VII, which is contrary to Massachusetts law and has been for quite a long time. And to be frank, it's just incorrect.
Well, I suspect that somewhere behind all the weeds around this, there is this sort of a tone about, originalist interpretation of the Constitution. And, back in the late 1700s, nobody was talking about sexual orientation in a legal sense. So couldn't the Trump administration have a point somewhere in all of that?
I mean, this is not something that's a new issue. We have litigated for quite some time on what falls under sex in a traditional sense and not. And in Massachusetts, for a very long time, we have identified sexual orientation as a protected class. It's sad to see that when considering civil rights, it's not generally considered a right for your person and your sex and your partner and your identity, the way it is to be sort of black, to be white, to be a person of color. That is something that we have identified for a very long time. A person is not just one thing. We believe in intersectionality. We believe in multiple types of identities and the right to be able to be that person free from any sort of infringement on your personal rights. And that's all this is here. This is a reality in which it doesn't match up with the law. The law recognizes people's rights to be gay, to be black, to be female, and the Trump administration is simply incorrect about this.
Well, since this is coming out of Washington, I imagine that nothing's going to change dramatically right away in Massachusetts, but what could eventually happen? I mean, how could it change things for LGBT people?
Well, you're right. So a lot of the rhetoric that we've heard since Trump took administration is simply that, is rhetoric. It is a pop on a Twitter feed. It is a pop on the nighttime news. But we have yet to see a lot of law that has changed. I think a good example of that would be the Muslim ban and the sanctuary city executive orders. Although there's been very ongoing, long-standing legal fights about that, we haven't necessarily seen that play out. And in part, I believe that's because we're correct. So the Lawyers Committee was involved in the sanctuary city executive order, and we got that national preliminary injunction to stop them from being able to take funding from cities like Lawrence, like Chelsea, that we represent. And I think that if, for some reason, this brief that the DOJ filed were to actually make any headway in a legal sense, that we would also see opponents stand up, like we did for the sanctuary cities, and fight that tooth and nail as well. And I think that we would be victorious.
This is BNN News, and we're talking with Sophia Hall from the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights and Economic Justice. Of course, another reason for the pushback against LGBT rights, at least there is the argument that they're protecting other rights, even First Amendment rights, religious practice rights. Isn't that going to be part of the mix here, too?
I mean, who's to say what sort of rhetoric the government's going to use, right? What they think is going to be the quickest sort of talking point or snapshot to be picked up in the news. But the reality is that I believe that America has become a more accepting place, a place where individuals can not only personally learn to express their own identities, but a society in which we should learn to enjoy those, to invite those, to welcome those identities. And I think that that's the direction that the law has gone. In places where it has not, in some southern states which have not been as forward-thinking as Massachusetts, there are still people on the ground fighting for those rights. Again, the civil rights is not sort of like a black-white binary anymore. It is a total identity that should be respected by the law. And I think that intersectionality of those identities, or recognition of that, is really us saying that society has matured.
Well, if you roll back the clock a few decades, there was a time when LGBT people could have jobs, they could serve in the military as long as they were invisible. What's the price of being invisible?
Well, I think some people say it's everything. I mean, to be a person that can't have an identity, that can't be accepted for who they are, to me, it's the utmost shame. You know, it's the utmost disappointment in our society. If we cannot respect individuals' choices about who they are, about their being, then what sort of society are we? I mean, we at the Lawyers Committee really do believe in people's right to be every component of themselves, because none of us are flat characters. You know, all of us have different identities, have different ways of expressing ourselves, and we should be able to. And the law should recognize that.
Of course, one of the other things the Lawyers Committee has been working on recently is an effort to somehow increase diversity on the Boston Police Department and the Fire Department because of the retirements now of people who were hired under affirmative action. I guess things are moving backward in terms of diversity. So what's the best hope for not losing ground?
Well, I mean, we've put out multiple suggestions to the city, whether it is the creation of a cadet program for the fire department, whether it is the shortening of a residency time requirement that we have for both fire and police. But the reality is that diversity is really important. And that is a message that you hear all the time now, but we're not seeing it play out in action. Is that we live in a society, in Boston particularly, which is more than 50% people of color, more than 50% minority. And it's really problematic when you live and you function in a society that does not reflect that back. What that tells people is that they do not belong, they don't matter, they don't count, because they're not seeing themselves reflected back. And that's a problem.
No, I have heard some other people, especially on the city council, talk about why it might be a good idea to change the residency requirement. I guess right now you don't have to live in the city very long in order to qualify for being a police officer or a firefighter. What would you do to change that, and why would it make such a big difference?
So there's a 1-year residency requirement that is required now in Boston and Massachusetts, and we are looking to lengthen that to 3 years. There's actually been a bill at City Hall, a bill that's made up to the mayor's office before, that's been vetoed. And in essence, the argument is that for individuals that may be attracted to the Commonwealth who would come in from outside of our boundaries and potentially only have to be here for a very short period of time, but may have other criteria that would make them higher ranking on those civil service lists, by lengthening that time, people would have to either be here and be committed partners in Massachusetts for some time before they become eligible. In essence, it would allow people who are native, who are local to the area, to be able to have the same sort of preferences that those who come in from other areas would.
Thank you very much for being with us.
Yeah, thank you.
Sophia Hall from the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights and Economic Justice. We'll have more news in just a moment.